The Galactic Academy's Advanced Xenobiology final was legendary for all the wrong reasons. Students called it the Reaper's Quiz because Professor Vorthak had a 93% failure rate and seemed to take personal pleasure in watching young minds crumble under academic pressure. The exam room looked like a cross between a laboratory and a morgue, with sterile white walls and specimen containers that practically screamed, "Touch me and die horribly." Jake Martinez sat in the back row, looking about as concerned as someone waiting for their coffee order. While his classmates frantically flipped through their notes like their lives depended on it, which honestly they probably did, Jake was examining his fingernails with the focused attention of a bored teenager. To his left sat Zix, a mantis-like creature whose compound eyes were darting between 17 different study guides simultaneously. The poor guy was clicking his mandibles so rapidly it sounded like a typewriter having a seizure. Every few seconds he'd emit a high-pitched whine that roughly translated to, "I'm going to fail and disappoint my entire hive cluster." In front of Jake, Glumbo the gelatinous was literally vibrating with anxiety. His translucent blue form kept shifting between different shapes as stress hormones coursed through his cytoplasm. One moment he looked like a worried puddle, the next like a terrified jello mold. His species communicated through color changes, and right now, he was flashing every shade of panic known to science. Then there was Kree, the reptilian know-it-all who sat in the front row with his scaled chest puffed out in false confidence. He'd been bragging for weeks about how his photographic memory would make this exam trivial. Currently, his forked tongue was flicking out every 2 seconds, tasting the fear pheromones in the air, and probably regretting his earlier cockiness. Professor Vorthak himself was a sight to behold. Imagine a giant slug had a baby with a briefcase, and that baby went to law school. His slimy, purple-gray form oozed authority as he glided between the specimen tables, arranging deadly botanical samples with the care of someone setting a very elaborate trap. His 4 eye stalks moved independently, allowing him to simultaneously judge multiple students' terror levels while organizing his collection of academic destruction. The silence in the room was broken only by the gentle hum of containment fields and Zix's nervous clicking. Jake stretched lazily and glanced around at his fellow students with mild curiosity, like he was people-watching at a mall food court instead of preparing to face the galaxy's most feared botanical examination. "Attention! Specimens!" Professor Vorthak's voice oozed through the room's speakers, with all the warmth of a tax audit. "Today you will demonstrate your knowledge of the galaxy's most dangerous flora, or you will join the ranks of those who thought they were clever enough to pass my examination without proper preparation." He paused dramatically, letting one eye stalk focus on each student in turn. When his gaze reached Jake, who was now doodling what appeared to be a sandwich on his desk, the professor's slime trail actually paused mid-drip. "Let us begin with something simple," Vorthak announced, his voice dripping with the kind of sadistic glee usually reserved for dentists and parking meter attendants. Professor Vorthak's eye stalks converged on a containment unit that hummed ominously in the center of the room. With theatrical precision that would make Shakespeare weep, he activated the field generator. Inside sat what looked like a perfectly innocent purple flower, if innocent flowers typically came with their own hazmat warning labels and radiation detectors. "Behold," Vorthak intoned with the reverence of someone unveiling the crown jewels, "the crimson death bloom of Xerion Prime. This specimen has been responsible for wiping out 3 separate colonial expeditions. Its pollen alone can cause complete organ failure in most carbon-based life forms within minutes of exposure." Zix immediately started hyperventilating, which for his species sounded like a broken air conditioner. Glumbo turned a sickly shade of green and began forming what appeared to be a protective shell around his core. Even Kree's confident posture wilted as his photographic memory helpfully supplied him with every gruesome detail he'd ever read about Xeron Prime incidents. The professor's eye stalks rotated smugly as he surveyed the appropriate level of terror his first specimen had induced. This was why he loved teaching. Nothing quite compared to watching young minds realize they were completely out of their depth. "Now then," Vorthak continued, "who can tell me the 3 primary methods this plant uses to—" "Excuse me, Professor." Jake's voice cut through the academic tension like a hot knife through butter. His hand was raised with the casual confidence of someone asking directions to the nearest bathroom. "Quick question about the death bloom thing." Every eye stalk in the room turned to focus on the human. The sudden attention didn't seem to faze Jake in the slightest. "Is this the kind you eat raw, or do you need to cook it first? Because it looks like it might be a little bitter straight off the stem." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop in the next solar system. Zix's clicking stopped entirely. Glumbo froze mid-color change, stuck somewhere between panic green and confusion cellar. Kree's forked tongue hung out of his mouth like a broken antenna. Professor Vortak's eye stalks actually tangled together in bewilderment. In 30 years of academic sadism, no student had ever responded to the crimson death bloom by asking about seasoning options. "I beg your pardon," Vortak managed, his usual authority replaced by genuine confusion. "Well," Jake continued cheerfully, "back home we've got something similar growing wild in the backyard. Mom usually tosses them in a stir-fry with some garlic and soy sauce. Pretty tasty actually, though you want to make sure you blanch them first to get rid of that weird numbing sensation." "Numbing sensation?" Vortak echoed weakly. "Yeah, you know how some plants make your tongue tingle? This purple stuff looks like it might do that. Probably want to pair it with something mild, maybe some rice or noodles to balance out." "Student Marganez!" Vortak's voice boomed through the speakers, though it cracked slightly on the last syllable. "This is not a cooking class. This plant is lethal to 99.7% of known sentient species." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Right, so definitely cook it first then, got it. What temperature are we talking, low and slow, or can you get away with a quick saute?" Zix made a sound like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. Glumbo had turned completely transparent, which his species only did in extreme shock. Even Kree was staring at Jake like he'd just announced his plans to juggle black holes for fun. Professor Vortak realized he was dealing with something far outside his experience. In all his years of terrorizing students with deadly flora, none had ever responded by discussing marinade techniques. Determined to restore his reputation as the galaxy's most feared professor, Vortak slithered over to his premium collection of academic nightmares. If one deadly plant couldn't shake this human's bizarre confidence, perhaps something more exotic would do the trick. "Very well," he announced, activating a containment field around a writhing mass of black vines covered in thorns that seemed to bend light around them. "Perhaps you'd care to comment on the Shadow Strangler of Doomtar 7. This carnivorous plant has been known to drag entire spacecraft into its root system and dissolve them with its acidic secretions." Jake squinted at the specimen with the focused attention of someone comparison shopping for houseplants. "Oh, neat. It's like a Venus flytrap, but supersized. Do the vines grow year-round, or is this more of a seasonal thing? Because if you could cultivate these properly, you'd never need a security system again." Zix's compound eyes actually crossed, which was mathematically impressive, considering he had about 40 of them. Glumbo had started making a low humming sound that his species typically reserved for witnessing the heat death of the universe. "Security system," Vortak sputtered. "It dissolves metal." "Right, but think about the applications," Jake continued enthusiastically. "Natural pest control, property protection, and I bet if you dried the vines properly, you could make some really durable rope. My Uncle Dave would love something like this for his farm. He's always complaining about people trying to steal his tomatoes." Professor Vortak's eye stalks were now moving in patterns that defied several laws of physics. He glided frantically to his next specimen, a crystalline formation that pulsed with malevolent energy. "The mind-melting crystal weed of Psychos Prime," he declared, his voice climbing toward hysteria. "Exposure to its spores causes complete psychological breakdown and permanent insanity in any creature with a developed nervous system." Jake tilted his head thoughtfully. "Does it grow in low light? Because this would be perfect for my dorm room. Really ties the space together, you know? Very feng shui. Plus, if it keeps my roommate from borrowing my stuff without asking, that's just a bonus." At this point, Kree had given up all pretense of academic dignity and was openly staring at Jake like he was watching someone casually juggle live grenades while riding a unicycle. His forked tongue hung out permanently now, apparently broken by the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. "Student Martinez!" Vortak bellowed, though his voice cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom. "These are not decorative plants. They are instruments of mass destruction, weapons of botanical warfare, the stuff of nightmares." "Oh, weapons," Jake nodded with sudden understanding. "Well, why didn't you say so? That changes everything. See, back on Earth we've got this thing called Australia, and honestly, these specimens are basically like houseplants compared to what grows wild there. I mean, we've got trees that explode, grass that cuts through steel, and flowers that make you hallucinate your own death while slowly digesting you from the inside out." The silence that followed was so profound it had its own gravitational pull. Zix had stopped moving entirely, resembling a very confused statue. Glumbo appeared to be having some sort of existential crisis, cycling through colors that didn't have names in most languages. "You have plants that explode?" Vortak whispered, all pretense of academic authority abandoned. Well, yeah, Jake shrugged. The eucalyptus trees are basically nature's hand grenades when it gets dry enough. And don't get me started on the Gimpy Jimpy plant. That thing makes your crystal spore stuff look like a relaxing spa treatment. One touch and you'll be begging for death for about 6 months, assuming you survive the initial contact. Professor Vortak realized with growing horror that he wasn't examining a student. He was staring at a survivor from what could only be described as a botanical hellscape masquerading as a planet. This human spoke about weaponized flora with the casual familiarity of someone discussing the weather. "What kind of death world do you come from?" he asked weakly. Jake looked genuinely confused by the question. "Death world? Nah, Earth's pretty mild, actually. I mean, sure, we've got some spicy plants, but they're not that bad once you know what to look for. My grandmother used to make tea from stuff that would probably hospitalize half this class." Professor Vorthak's eye stalks were now twitching in patterns that suggested either deep contemplation or complete nervous breakdown. In 30 years of academic sadism, he had never encountered a student who treated his collection of galactic terror like a farmer's market catalog. Desperate times called for desperate measures. With the ceremonial gravity of someone unveiling a nuclear warhead, Vorthak approached the final containment unit. This one was different from the others, reinforced with triple-layer shielding, wrapped in warning labels in 47 different languages, and humming with enough defensive energy to power a small space station. Even the other professors avoided this corner of the lab. "Behold," Vorthak announced, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow managed to fill the entire room. "The crown jewel of my collection, the Omega Nightshade of the Forbidden Sector. This single specimen is responsible for the complete extinction of the Zephyrian civilization. An entire star system. Gone. Not a single survivor. They called it the end of gardens, the final harvest, the last thing you'll ever see." The containment field flickered away, to reveal what looked like an innocent cluster of dark purple berries on delicate green stems. If you ignored the fact that the air around it seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy, and the faint screaming sound that might have been your imagination, it could have been mistaken for something you'd find at a roadside produce stand. "Legend says," Vorthak continued, building to his dramatic crescendo, "that a single berry contains enough concentrated death to sterilize an entire moon. The Zephyrines tried to study it, tried to understand its power. The last transmission from their homeworld was a single word: mistake." Zix had apparently entered some kind of protective catatonia, his compound eyes glazed over with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too much. Klumbo had turned completely clear except for a tiny speck of consciousness huddled in his center like a terrified hermit crab. Kree was making small whimpering sounds while his photographic memory helpfully supplied him with detailed images of planetary extinction. The professor's 4 eye stalks all focused on Jake with the intensity of orbital death lasers, waiting for the human to finally show some appropriate fear in the face of ultimate botanical destruction. Jake leaned forward in his chair, squinting at the berries with the concentrated attention of someone trying to read fine print. After a moment of careful consideration, he sat back with a look of delighted recognition. "Oh, cool. It's like Nightshade but spicier looking. You know, this would be perfect for tacos." The sound Professor Vortak made could best be described as what happens when a deflating balloon tries to scream in existential horror. His slime trail actually reversed direction, something that violated several laws of mollusk physics. "Perfect for what?" he whispered. "Tacos," Jake repeated cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the fact that he had just suggested using galactic extinction in a tortilla. See, the thing about nightshade varieties is that you've got to know which parts are safe to eat. The berries are usually the dangerous bit, but if you prepare them right, they add this really nice smoky flavor. My cousin Tony runs a food truck in Phoenix, and he does this amazing salsa verde with ingredients that would probably violate about 12 interstellar treaties. "You eat nightshade," Vorthak stated, his voice hollow with the realization that everything he thought he knew about toxicology was wrong. "Well, sure," Jake shrugged. "I mean, tomatoes are nightshade family, and so are potatoes and eggplant and peppers. Pretty much half of Earth cuisine comes from plants that other species would probably classify as chemical weapons. Heck, we've got people who eat ghost peppers for fun, and those things register on the Scoville scale somewhere between liquid pain and war crime." "Chemical weapons," Professor Vortak repeated faintly. "Oh yeah, definitely. My mom grows castor beans in her garden just because they look nice, and those things produce ricin, super deadly. Then there's oleander, beautiful flowers, but every part of the plant could kill you if you're not careful. We use it for landscaping outside of elementary schools. Jake was warming up now, like someone who had finally found a topic they could really sink their teeth into. And don't even get me started on mushrooms. We've got varieties that'll give you the trip of your life, others that'll shut down your liver in about 6 hours, and some that do both at the same time. There's this one called the Destroying Angel that's basically nature's way of saying, you picked the wrong salad ingredients, buddy. But hey, we also eat the ones that don't kill us, so it all balances out. Zix made a sound like a broken mechanical toy winding down. Glumbo had achieved a level of transparency that suggested he was attempting to phase shift into another dimension entirely. Kree's scales had gone completely pale, which for his species usually only happened during near-death experiences. You live on a planet, Vorthak said slowly, where you casually consume substances that could be used to commit genocide. I guess? Jake looked genuinely confused by the professor's distress. I mean, it's all about preparation and dosage, right? The poisons in the dose and all that? We've been eating this stuff for thousands of years. My great-grandmother used to make jam from elderberries, and those are technically toxic if you eat them wrong. But her jam was amazing. Won prizes at the county fair 3 years running. County fair, the professor whispered. Yeah, it's this local competition where people show off their best homemade stuff. Preserves, pies, pickled vegetables. My neighbor Mrs. Henderson makes these incredible pickled peppers that are basically edible napalm. She uses Carolina Reapers and something called Dragon's Breath peppers that were literally developed as weapons research, but some genius decided they'd be great for hot sauce. Professor Vortak realized with dawning cosmic horror that he was looking at a representative of a species that had turned planetary toxicology into competitive recreational activities. They didn't just survive in the presence of deadly plants. They had domesticated them, cultivated them, turned them into entertainment. What kind of monsters are you? He breathed. Jake blinked at the professor with genuine surprise, like someone who had just been asked to explain why water was wet. Monsters? Nah, we're just adaptive. I mean, when your planet's trying to kill you in creative new ways every few thousand years, you learn to roll with it. Or you don't stick around long enough to complain about it. The casual way Jake dismissed what amounted to evolutionary warfare as a minor inconvenience finally broke something fundamental in Professor Vorthak's worldview. His eye stalks drooped like deflated balloons at a very depressing birthday party. You know what, Jake continued, apparently deciding that his traumatized classmates needed some helpful life advice. You guys are looking at this all wrong. These plants aren't scary, they're just misunderstood. Here, let me show you. Before anyone could stop him, Jake stood up and walked directly toward the containment field surrounding the Omega Nightshade. Zix made a sound like a smoke detector having a panic attack. Glumbo had apparently achieved a state of existential transparency that bordered on the philosophical. Even Kree, who had been unconscious for the past 5 minutes, snapped awake with the survival instincts of prey animals everywhere. Student Markthas, do not approach the specimen, Vorthak bellowed, though his voice cracked like he was going through puberty again. The containment field is the only thing preventing immediate ATM ospheric cannonation. Jake paused and looked back with the patient expression of someone explaining internet passwords to their grandparents. Oh, you mean this little energy bubble? Yeah. That's probably overkill. Look, I get that you want to be safe, but this is like wearing a hazmat suit to handle poison ivy. Sure, it'll work, but it's kind of missing the point. He gestured toward the bears with the casual confidence of a man who had apparently never met a plant he couldn't befriend or eat. See, the trick with nightshade family plants is understanding their chemical composition. This particular variety looks like it's got a high concentration of solanine alkaloids, probably glycoalkaloids too, based on that purple coloration. That's what gives them the punch, but it's also what makes them predictable. Predictable, Professor Vorthak repeated, in the same tone someone might say nuclear winter. Exactly. Once you know what you're dealing with, it's just chemistry. Heat breaks down most alkaloids, acid neutralizes others, and time and fermentation can transform the dangerous compounds into something completely harmless. Humans figured this out about 10,000 years ago, when we started making alcohol from things that would technically qualify as poison. Jake turned to address his fellow students, who were all staring at him like he had just announced his plans to arm wrestle a supernova. Look, guys, I know this seems scary, but it's really not that complicated. You just need to understand your environment and work with it instead of against it. He pointed to Zix first. You, with the compound eyes, your species has incredible visual processing power, right? You could probably identify dangerous plants from half a kilometer away just by analyzing their electromagnetic signatures. That's way better than anything humans can do. Zix's clicking resumed, but slower now, more thoughtful than panicked. And you, Jake nodded toward Glimbo, who was slowly regaining some color and definition. Your cellular structure lets you literally taste the air around you. You could detect chemical traces at parts per billion levels. You're basically a living chemical analysis lab. Glumbo pulsed a tentative shade of curious yellow. Even you, Jake said to the still pale Cree. With that photographic memory, you could build a complete database of every dangerous plant in the galaxy and cross-section it with safe handling procedures faster than any computer system. Cree's forked tongue flicked out experimentally, tasting the air with new purpose. The problem isn't that these plants are deadly, Jake explained, settling back into his chair like a professor giving a guest lecture. The problem is that you're approaching them from a position of fear instead of understanding. Back home, we've got a saying, the dose makes the poison. Everything's toxic if you have enough of it, and nothing's toxic if you know how to handle it properly. Professor Vortak's eye stalks were slowly untangling themselves as a new and terrifying possibility occurred to him. Are you suggesting that we've been teaching botanical xenobiology completely wrong for the past 3 centuries? Well, Jake said diplomatically, maybe not wrong exactly, more like overly cautious. I mean, I get it, safety first and all that. But you can't really understand something if you're too afraid to get close to it. It's like trying to study swimming by reading about water from across the room. The professor glided closer to Jake with the careful movements of someone approaching a potentially dangerous but fascinating new discovery. Student Martinez, would you be willing to demonstrate some of these handling techniques for the class? Sure, but I should probably mention that I'm not actually a xenobiology major, Jake admitted cheerfully. I'm studying comparative literature. This was just an elective because I needed the science credits to graduate. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the sound of Professor Vortak's entire academic career imploding like a star going supernova. Literature? He whispered. Yeah, I'm writing my thesis on agricultural metaphors in pre-contact Terran poetry. Turns out, when your entire civilization is built around domesticating things that are actively trying to kill you, it shows up a lot in the creative writing. Who knew? Zik started laughing, a sound like wind chimes having the time of their life. Glumbo turned a delighted shade of pink and began forming what might have been applause-shaped pseudopods. Even Cree managed a weak grin, his scales slowly returning to their normal color. Professor Vortak looked around his classroom full of students who were no longer terrified, at his collection of specimens that suddenly seemed less like instruments of academic torture and more like learning opportunities, and at the human who had just casually revolutionized 3 centuries of xenobotanical education as a hobby. Student Martinez, he said slowly, how would you feel about guest lecturing my advanced toxicology seminar next semester? 3 hours later, the exam that was supposed to leave half the class in academic ruins had somehow transformed into the most successful learning experience in Galactic Academy history. Jake had passed with what Professor Vortak was calling unprecedented excellence, though the professor seemed to be having some kind of existential crisis about what exactly constituted excellence anymore. Zix had not only passed, but had volunteered to help create a new visual identification database for dangerous flora, his compound eyes suddenly seeming like a superpower, rather than just extra homework when it came to reading assignments. His clicking had evolved from panicked staccato to an excited rhythm that sounded almost musical. Glumbo had discovered that his cellular structure made him the perfect early warning system for chemical hazards, and was already planning to switch his major from theoretical mathematics to applied biochemistry. His color changes had stabilized into a confident azure blue, with swirls of ambitious gold. Even Cree had found his groove, realizing that his photographic memory combined with Jake's practical approach could make him the galaxy's foremost expert on botanical risk assessment. He was already mentally composing the abstract for his doctoral dissertation, his scales having returned to their normal proud emerald shade. Professor Vortak, meanwhile, was experiencing what could only be described as a complete academic renaissance. 3 centuries of teaching students to fear plants had been overturned in a single afternoon by a literature major who treated galactic superweapons like spice rack ingredients. I've been thinking about your teaching methods, Jake said as he packed up his notebook, apparently oblivious to the fact that he had just revolutionized interstellar education. You might want to consider adding some hands-on components to your curriculum. Maybe start with some of the safer specimens and work your way up. Build confidence instead of, traumatizing everyone. Hands-on components, Vortak repeated, his eye stalks twitching as he mentally redesigned his entire course structure. Yes, that makes perfect sense. Perhaps we could start with some basic Earth plants for comparison. Do you think your homeworld would be willing to provide some specimens for educational purposes? Jake paused in his packing, a slightly worried expression crossing his face. Well, maybe start with something really mild. You probably don't want to jump straight into the Australian stuff. That might be a little intense for beginners. What would you recommend as a suitable introduction to Earth botany? Vortak asked, pulling out his tablet to take notes with the enthusiasm of someone discovering fire. Oh, I don't know, maybe some mint or basil? Something from a regular herb garden? Though I guess even those might be pretty potent compared to what you're used to. Actually, you know what? Let me talk to my mom about this. She'll know what would be safe for beginners. She teaches elementary school, so she's got experience explaining dangerous things to people who don't know better. The professor's note-taker paused. Your mother teaches children about dangerous plants. Well, yeah, basic safety stuff. You know, don't eat random berries, how to identify poison ivy, which mushrooms will kill you versus which ones just taste terrible. Standard curriculum for anyone who wants to survive past age 10 on Earth. Zix made his new musical clicking sound. Your planet teaches survival skills to children? Sure. Doesn't everyone? I mean, how else would kids know not to touch the pretty red berries or the shiny three-leafed plants? Though I guess if your planets don't have murderous flora everywhere, you probably don't need to cover that in kindergarten. Glumbo pulsed a thoughtful purple. What age do human children learn to identify lethal plants? Oh, pretty early. Most kids can spot poison ivy by age 4 or 5. By the time they're 10, they usually know the basics of what not to eat in the wild. My little sister could identify deathcap mushrooms before she could properly tie her shoes. The collective realization that humans were teaching toddlers advanced toxicology as basic life skills settled over the room like a gentle blanket of cosmic horror. You know, Jake continued cheerfully, speaking of kids, I should probably get going. I promised my roommate I'd help him with his astrophysics homework, and I still need to grab lunch. Do you know if the cafeteria is still serving that green stuff? It looked pretty good, kind of reminded me of this seaweed salad my aunt makes. Professor Vorthak's eye stalks all focused on Jake with laser intensity. Student Martinez, the green substance in the cafeteria is a synthetic nutrient paste designed to be palatable to carbon-based life forms. It's not actually food in the traditional sense. Oh cool, so it's like those meal replacement bars. Yeah, those are fine. I lived on protein shakes and instant noodles for most of freshman year. As long as it's got calories and doesn't taste like sadness, I'm good. Jake headed toward the door, then paused and turned back with a helpful afterthought. Oh, Professor, if you do decide to add practical components to your course, you might want to warn the other students first. Some of them look pretty stressed out today. Maybe start with a meditation session or something. He left with a casual wave, completely unaware that he had just redefined the entire field of xenobotanical education and possibly saved several academic careers in the process. Professor Vorthak watched him go, then slowly turned to survey his classroom full of newly confident students and his collection of specimens that suddenly seemed less like instruments of terror and more like teaching tools, waiting to be properly understood. Class, he announced, his voice carrying a new note of excitement. I believe we need to completely redesign our curriculum. Who wants to help me figure out how to teach botanical appreciation to a galaxy that's apparently been doing it wrong for 3 centuries? The enthusiastic response from his students suggested that Jake Martinez, literature major and casual toxicology revolutionary, had just started something much bigger than a simple exam review. As the newly energized class began planning their academic rebellion, somewhere in the cafeteria, Jake was happily eating synthetic nutrient paste and wondering why everyone thought his planet was so dangerous. After all, they'd only had a few mass extinctions, and most of those were totally natural disasters. Well, mostly natural. The Great Emu War didn't really count.